Espinosa says rich countries aren't doing enough to lift emerging economies in this transition to a low carbon future. We begin this hour, though, with that 2-day virtual climate summit at the White House. The president pledging to slash greenhouse gas emissions by 50% in the next decade. He made this pledge in front of more than 40 world leaders. Yahoo Finance's Jessica Smith is following the developments for us from Washington. And Jess, this was really a symbolic message more than anything. The president trying to show that the U.S. is back in the game, willing to lead on this conversation now.
Right, Akiko, that was one of the promises that President Biden made on the campaign trail to make the U.S. a leader in the fight against climate change after President Trump left the Paris Climate Accord and he rolled back so many environmental regulations. The White House is using this summit to show that climate is once again a priority, to set new targets for the U.S. and to try and draw commitments from the rest of the world. Of course, as you mentioned, the White House did announce this morning that the U.S. will aim to cut its greenhouse gas emissions by 50 to 52% from 2005 levels by the year 2030. That's nearly double the commitment that President Obama made in the Paris Climate Accord in 2015. Now, this morning, the president said that the world must make decisions this decade to avoid the worst consequences of the climate crisis. But he said the U.S. cannot do it alone. Let's watch.
All of us, and particularly those of us who represent the world's largest economies, we have to step up. Those that do take action and make bold investments in their people and clean energy future will win the good jobs of tomorrow and make their economies more resilient and more competitive. So let's run that race. Win more sustainable future than we have now, overcome the existential crisis of our times.
China's President Xi said that China would strictly limit increasing coal consumption, and he also repeated his pledge to achieve carbon neutrality by 2060. Russian President Vladimir Putin also made some vague promises to reduce emissions. And then other countries like Japan, India, Canada, many others have made commitments to ramp up their efforts to fight climate change. Now, of course, Congress is going to have to play a role in enacting some of these policies that will be necessary if the U.S. is going to meet its emissions reduction target. And that could be difficult. We already heard from Minority Leader Mitch McConnell on the Senate floor today, really bashing President Biden's climate plan, saying that it was going to kill American jobs. And of course, that is the issue that we have heard from many Republicans as they criticize President Biden's infrastructure plan and all of the clean energy proposals that are included in it. Zach and Akiko.
And we will be talking a lot more about some of those political challenges facing the president and his climate action plan there. Jessica Smith, thanks so much for bringing that to us. Zach, it's interesting. It's really rare to see countries gather in this way outside of the annual UN Climate Summit. We're talking about some of these countries going public with their pledges 7 months ahead of COP26, which is set to be held in Glasgow. But there's a lot of skeptics out there, and I think that's important to note because the U.S. has been seen as sort of a country that sort of put one foot into the climate fight and then only to step back. Remember, if you go back to the original international agreement, the Kyoto Protocol, that was signed under President Clinton in '97. President Bush came in, withdrew from that. President Obama came on board with the Paris Agreement. And then you had President Trump withdraw from that, too. So internationally, the president really trying to make a statement, at least with today's White House summit, to say this time around, things are different.
Yeah, and I don't know how effective it might be to maybe assuage any fears that it will actually be different this time around, Akiko, because, that's what's happened historically as you kind of walk through there. And really, when you step back and look at the size of the problem and just in general, behavioral economists can look at this and just talk about it being, just a problem in terms of how you can get international agreements to come to, leaders to come to the table and say, look, we are going to stick with this. Because it's a tough sell when they go back to their constituents at home and say, yeah, look, this is what we agreed to. This is what we're going to do. But I mean, when you look into the numbers, Akiko, and you look at what some of these countries are agreeing to, part of the problem, and Republicans' critiques of this is that the U.S. is kind of saddling themselves while some of these emerging economies, mainly China, is able to push off and keep using coal and burning less clean energy the same way. So, I mean, what's fair when you look at it and kind of say, all right, they have a little bit more of a runway since they are emerging to keep doing that, and where the U.S. falls?
Oh, you've got a problem that's really twofold. On the one hand, to your point, you've got the developed countries. I would put China in that category as well. The largest emitters of greenhouse gas emissions having to commit to actual tangible solutions. But you've also got emerging economies who are equally, if some would argue, more vulnerable to climate change, who simply don't have the funds in place to invest in the kind of technology that needs to make a difference. And that's something the UN has been talking about, saying the rich countries need to pick up the slack and commit to climate financing on an international level, something we're going to be speaking with Patricia Espinoza about over at the UN a little later in the show. But coming up, we're going to be talking about the domestic picture here, a conversation with White House National Climate Advisor Gina McCarthy. We are talking to her about the future of the fossil fuels industry in the U.S. and what she sees as the economic case for climate action. Before we go to break, though, take a look at the change we have seen in CO2 emissions by fuel over the last 5 years. 5 years since the Paris Climate Agreement was signed. Despite economic activity increasing above 2019 levels this year, we're looking at demand really picking up after the big dip that you see there that happened as a result of the lockdowns in the pandemic. The IEA forecast that we could return to pre-crisis levels this year is certainly going to be a part of that discussion over at the summit. We'll be right back. Welcome back to Yahoo Finance's hour-long special on this Earth Day, Planet Earth in Crisis. The Biden administration has publicly vowed to move aggressively on the issue of climate change since day one, and those efforts being led by Gina McCarthy, the first White House national advisor on climate. We spoke to McCarthy about the president's initiatives, specifically his infrastructure bill, and the White House push to make the electricity grid carbon-free by 2035. I started the conversation with her by asking her, what's the energy mix that gets you there?
Well, I think there's lots of opportunities to get us there, but we know that there's a transition from fossil fuel to clean energy. We know even in the prior administration that their interest in rebuilding coal has fallen short because clean energy is cheaper. Clean energy is cleaner. Clean energy helps us clean up the air as well as deliver electricity at prices that people can afford. So we are going to be investing in a grid infrastructure, in our transmission lines, so that we can make sure that everybody has access to clean energy and everybody has resilience in their system so that the problems we experienced a few months ago in Texas don't get revisited again, which was a cold snap that actually caused many people to lose their lives because there was no resilience in the transmission system itself. So we think there's every opportunity to actually look at a variety of ways of moving forward with clean energy, but also to look at carbon capture and sequestration so that we can make the technologies available to every utility as we move forward. We're looking at nuclear as being part of the mix. The president's interest isn't in taking technology solutions off the table. It's actually investing in technology solutions as we move forward.
So when you look at that goal, it sounds like you still see a role for fossil fuels, but offsetting that with carbon capture.
We do see that the transition is going to take some time. So there is no question that we need to look at carbon capture and sequestration. But we also know that clean energy is winning in the marketplace, and we're going to continue to advance all those opportunities. The president doesn't want to take things off the table. He wants to invest in what's available today, recognizing that the future will be won by the country that gets to the finish line on clean energy first. And he certainly wants the United States to be that country.
The president has packaged this infrastructure bill as a jobs act aimed at investing in the green economy. But there's a lot of communities across the country that hear green economy and see job losses. How do you keep people in their jobs while also transitioning into this new economy that some would argue is still in the very early stages?
Well, I don't know whether I would argue that this is in the early stages because clean energy is quite considerable in every region of the country now in terms of its visibility and its competitiveness. But you're right, there are skeptics. But President Biden is basically a jobs and union guy, and he's also a person who cares about fairness and equity. So he's not just looking at the communities that have been left behind that need benefits. He's also recognizing with his eyes wide open that there has already been a transition. We're looking at areas of our country that have been disinvested in because, for example, in coal country, where coal has become less competitive and those jobs have shrunk. And so the idea is not to deny it, but to embrace that challenge and begin to invest in it. So part of his American Jobs Plan and work we're doing is to develop a strategy that reinvests in those communities. We've already identified $260 million in investments in communities in coal country to put people back to work in their communities with their existing skill set to start closing those old coal mines that have been abandoned and oil and gas well infrastructure that is spewing methane out, because it's a double win. It puts them back to work, making the kind of living with the kind of training they already have. Plus, we're going to actually address the methane emissions that are so dangerous to climate change. But it also has a lot of opportunity in the American Jobs Plan for training opportunities, for apprenticeships, working with our unions to start with that transition. So we're not going to go into this by denying that there is a transition that's been happening and will continue to happen. But we need to just go into that recognizing that investments to those communities means that we're dealing with this challenge in a proactive and aggressive way. And so we shouldn't have to leave anybody behind. The United States has to be smarter and more creative than that. And so we're doing that, and we'd have a plan for it, and we're going to move that forward.
That pause that you've put in place to issue any new oil and gas leasing on federal lands,
Yeah.
how long do you expect that review to take? What does that timeline look like right now?
Well, the reason for the lease was that we recognized that there were literally, millions of acres that are being tied up, that are non-productive, that are public lands. And we also realized that we haven't for years taken a look at the kind of money that is accrued to those states and those areas where those leases have already been afforded. And we should relook at all of those things. So we're talking about an opportunity that we've already taken to have a hearing on this issue. This is not about stopping permitting, just leases, recognizing that there's a lot of leases out there that are not being worked, where there's no activity. And we're going to be relooking at that and determining how we can restart that leasing program in a way that makes sure that as public lands are tied up, that they're being used for productively, but also that the states are being paid a fair revenue from that land that's being occupied. And so hopefully that will only be, we already did a hearing. We're likely to have a report done very shortly. So we'll be working with folks, keeping everybody in the news, but we're not right now in a shortage of leases. There's plenty of them out there. That's part of the challenge.
I wonder how you're thinking about the role of the private sector in getting to that ultimate goal of net zero by 2050. How much of the responsibility should be placed on some of these major firms, and how much of the larger goal here you think would actually require regulation in place, whether that's through disclosures for companies or through carbon taxes to make sure they are held accountable for the emissions?
Well, there's no question that we're still going to do our job and establish standards. We do that for health and other benefits. And you're right, the private sector has to be a partner in this. And they have to be able to account for how they invest their money. If it's yours, you'd want it. If it's mine, I want to know that as well. So we're looking at working with the private sector, not just in the financial risk area, but we're also looking at them so that as the president and as Congress sends signals about where we think the United States needs to head and how we're going to address the challenge of climate change and where we see the opportunities for job growth, we expect the private sector to respond to that. We generally see that when government leads, the private sector will take cognizance of that and move, and we expect that the private sector will become a partner in many of these efforts. If not, then you know that we're going to take other actions to make sure that we get where we need to go.
Let's talk about the competition with China. On the one hand, you've got the president saying we really want to build out the renewable energy in the US, build out the grid. And yet when you look at the supply chain, so much of that ties directly to China, whether that's solar energy or battery technology, other technology, green technology. Is there an inherent conflict here between the president saying, on the one hand, we're going to bring American jobs back by building out the green economy, when in reality, a lot of that build out only increases the US reliance on China?
Well, I think the president's understanding is that we can actually restart our manufacturing operations here, and we can recapture the supply chain we had ceded elsewhere, not just to China, but other countries. So as he sees it, we can use this as an opportunity to not just rekindle our manufacturing, but to do things like in the electric vehicle infrastructure. We're looking at working with the auto sector to actually start manufacturing these vehicles right here in the United States, not ceding that manufacturing to other countries. We're looking at investing in the electric vehicle infrastructure so that we'll have the demand for electric vehicles, because people will know they can get where they need to go and they can get back home again in a really high performing vehicle. We're looking at investing in battery manufacturing. We have 2 battery manufacturing plants that are starting up over the next few months that are servicing Ford and GM. Together, that's going to be a magnificent signal that right here in the United States, we're going to start manufacturing the supply chain and grabbing that back. And lastly, we've identified a number of states where lithium is available for mining operations, and that's going to be a key for our ability to grab back the battery manufacturing that's necessary not just for electric vehicles, but to grow our battery storage opportunities along transmission lines. So we have, I think, a goal not just to invest in manufacturing, but to invest in it right here in the United States and grow those jobs again and grab back the supply chains we have lost. These are really wonderful job opportunities. Many of them are already union. We want more because we want people to grow in the middle class again and to recognize that they have every opportunity, certainly that my family had, to actually make sure that we have a home we can live in, opportunities for home ownership, putting food on your family's tables. This pandemic has shown us the fragility of people's lives and livelihoods, and we have to respond to that by bringing back hope and opportunity. That's what this president is all about, and we're going to capture those opportunities.
White House National Climate Advisor Gina McCarthy speaking to us there. Coming up on our Earth Day special, we're talking about the political pushback against the scope of climate action. The president facing pressure, not just from Republican lawmakers, but Democrats as well. Yahoo Finance's Rick Newman will bring us that story on the other side of the break. But before we go to break, take a look at the average per capita emissions we have seen since 2015. The UN Environment Program saying the bulk of emissions comes from the top 1% income earners. But you see there, it is the lower income earners that are hit the most. We're going to be continuing to talk about that as well. We'll be right back after this short break. White House has said fossil fuels will remain a part of the country's energy mix, even as the president pushes to make the energy grid carbon free by 2035. He's likely to face a lot of pushback, though, from those within his own party. Yahoo Finance's Rick Newman following that story for us on this Earth Day. And Rick, you heard Gina McCarthy there say that, look, this is fossil fuels has to be a part of the transition. You can offset that with carbon capture and sequestration, but there's a lot of Democrats who've said that that really is just a short-term answer to a larger problem that should be addressed in more detail.
Yeah, I think she's actually being realistic about this. So to be specific, I think the kind of fossil fuels we're going to see remain in the system are natural gas fired power plants. I'm not sure about coal, but natural gas. And then we know that automobiles are going to run on gasoline. At least some of the automobiles will for decades. I mean, the average lifespan of a car is 20 years. And, right now we're only talking about less than 2% of new car sales are electric. So we're going to have gasoline powered cars in the system for a long time. Bernie Sanders and AOC, they can complain that the Biden plan doesn't go far enough. But look, I think it's going to actually be quite difficult to hit those targets Biden is talking about. This is not simple. This requires, among other things, massive changes to the electrical grid, a lot of stuff that's difficult to get permitting for across states and different parts of the country. Big questions about who's going to pay for all this. I mean, we're talking about stuff the country has never done before. So give Biden a shot. What he's trying is pretty difficult.
No, it is very difficult. And I remember you talking about this all the way back early on in the campaign trail, and we saw him kind of straddling this, and it's very tricky because he didn't want to lose those jobs in voters who had those jobs in key swing states, Pennsylvania being one of the ones that we talked about in quite detail. But when you look at it and step back and think about where he's at with Democrats in the Senate, Joe Manchin in West Virginia, one of the states that's still heavily dependent on coal. There aren't a lot of them that have a big coal lobby, but that would be one of them. So where do you put maybe how he sits politically with some of these more progressive agenda items when it comes to climate and how that battle looks in getting things done?
We're going to see exactly how this plays out during the next few months. So Senator Ron Wyden yesterday introduced a new tax plan that would repeal all the tax breaks for oil and gas companies and coal producers, and replace them with just 3 tax breaks that incentivize green energy. So somebody asked him, is Joe Manchin going to go along with this? That's the obvious question because they need every single Democratic vote to pass something like that. And Wyden basically said, look, I talk to Joe all the time. He knows what's in my bill. We have a plan. He didn't say how he's going to get Manchin's support and probably the support of a few other Democrats who are backed by energy interests. But they're going to have to do things like put tons of federal clean energy programs in states like West Virginia. Earmarks are back in Congress. So Manchin may say, I want this, that, and the other thing for my state. So I think the way this gets done, if it does, and it's going to be tough, is there's going to be a windfall of federal programs and federal money going to some of these states that are the toughest ones to get on board. I'm very interested to see how it plays out because, again, none of this is going to be easy because we're talking about major change. The oil and gas industry remains very powerful, very well funded, and it is a source of a lot of high paying jobs.
Yeah, we're talking about roughly 10 million jobs right now in the industry. So a lot of jitters out there, certainly about this big transition to a carbon-free economy. Rick Newman, thanks so much for bringing us that story. Coming up on our Earth Day special, we are talking about job creation in the green economy. The president has promised millions of new jobs, but why are some unions pushing back? AFL-CIO President Richard Trumka will be joining us for that conversation. But before we go to break, take a look at the median hourly wage for workers in the energy industry. Those working in the nuclear sector earning almost $40 an hour, while solar workers making less than $25 an hour. That's going to be part of our discussion after this break. Welcome back to Yahoo Finance's Earth Day special, Planet Earth in Crisis. President Biden has vowed to create millions of jobs through the green economy, but he faces a lot of skeptics who question the quality of those jobs that are likely to be created. Local unions in some parts of the country arguing those jobs in renewables just don't pay the same rate that oil and gas jobs do. Let's bring in Richard Trumka, AFL-CIO president. Richard, when we talk about the oil and gas industry, we're talking about 10 million jobs that are currently available, but there's certainly a lot of jitters out there, it seems, about how many of those will be eliminated in this transition. What are you hearing from your members?
Well, they're concerned. The transition shouldn't be all on our backs. Look, we provided energy, and you didn't mention coal. You mentioned oil and gas, but I'd mention all three of them. We've provided energy that this company has grown on, and it's built our economy. And now that we're transitioning to a smaller carbon footprint, those communities shouldn't be left behind, and they shouldn't have to be a promise to them. There ought to be investment. We ought to make sure that we're investing in the areas where jobs are lost. And the second thing is, you got to give us a pathway to make the jobs that are being created good middle class supporting jobs, because currently they're not. And that means changing the labor laws and passing the PRO Act.
Yeah, and Mr. Trumka, I mean, when we talk about the PRO Act and other pushes here, it was interesting to kind of hear Joe Manchin in West Virginia, as you talked about coal and the miners there in that union coming to say, look, we'll back a shift away from coal for more renewable jobs here as long as you help us out. When it comes to what that help looks like, it is all just about upskilling, or is it more to do about maybe protecting lost wages? And, post-pandemic, we've seen the government's pretty good at making sure they can assure wages here. So what does that plan look like to you to be fair to workers who are impacted by this change?
Well, I think it's got to be a little bit of all above. I mean, there's no cookie cutter that you can apply. In some areas, you can do mine reclamation and well reclamation, and we have the skills to do those jobs. They can be high-paying jobs. In other areas where you're going to lose those jobs, you got to make some kind of investment to bring new jobs in, and then give us a pathway to be able to make those jobs good jobs. Because the fight right now isn't between green and blue. The fight right now is green and blue against greed. You got a number of employers in the renewable energy system that are hell-bent on keeping those jobs non-union and low-paying. And we need to have a pathway to get through, and the current labor laws don't do that. They're 100 years old. They're antiquated, and any employer can use them to prevent workers from having a voice on the job, rather than, as it was originally intended, for them to have a pathway to have a voice on the job.
And on that front, we have heard from White House National Climate Advisor Gina McCarthy talking about ensuring that these jobs aren't just good paying jobs, but they are union jobs. I want you to take a listen to what she had to say, and I'll get your reaction on the other end.
President Biden is basically a jobs and union guy, and he's also a person who cares about fairness and equity. So he's not just looking at the communities that have been left behind that need benefits. He's also recognizing with his eyes wide open that there has already been a transition. We're looking at areas of our country that have been disinvested in because, for example, in coal country, where coal has become less competitive and those jobs have shrunk.
And Richard, I know you were supportive of the president when he was still a candidate because you said he was a unions guy. What's the conversation you've been having with the White House right now about the types of assurances you'd like in how this transition will look like for those who are in fact losing their jobs, in the quality of jobs that need to be created on the other side?
Well, first of all, getting to the transition should be an all-of-the-above strategy. And the president, we've talked to him about that, and the president's plan is an all-of-the-above strategy, which is very, very important. Look, his goals are very aggressive, but they're meant to meet this moment. And the president, I think, spoke from his heart about the workers affected and the opportunities that we have to create good union jobs. And he's supportive of the PRO Act. He's supportive of changing the labor laws. And he understands that if you destroy 100 jobs in southwestern Pennsylvania, and you create 100 jobs in California, that doesn't do you much good. He's committed to putting jobs back where they were lost, making sure that the people don't get left behind. And that will require a little bit of everything. It'll require help from the federal government, state government. It'll require some upskilling, and it will require investment so that good jobs can be created, and it will require the PRO Act to be passed so that we can make those jobs good paying jobs.
Yeah, let's dig into the PRO Act here too, because it's an interesting one as it passed the House, and obviously Republicans are going to, I'm sure, play their part to maybe block some things in the Senate. But when you look at it, critics might point out the fact that there are two things there that worry some when it comes to maybe turning over, employee information to union organizers, and the fact that they can go after people who didn't join the union and charge them essentially for deals that they negotiate on their side. So I mean, when you look at that as maybe worthy criticisms or changes that might need to happen to get Republican support in the Senate, I mean, where do you see that bill moving forward if Joe Biden's going to be the one out there to bring sides together?
Well, first of all, the privacy thing is sort of a red herring. We already get the information under the current rules. All it does is institutionalize those rules, because we get it now under an NLRB ruling, which obviously can be changed, and we're required to protect them. We don't give that information away. We don't sell it to anybody. We use it only so we can contact them and have a communication with them. Because here's what happens today. The employer takes people and he puts them in a room and he shuts the door. And I'll tell you what happened at Amazon. And he bombards them with this anti-union stuff, most of which is exaggeration and many lies. And if anybody at Amazon tried to get up and refute that, they'd take a picture of that employee, and then they'd dismiss him from the meeting. Says to everybody else, keep your mouth shut, don't say a word, or I'll dismiss you from the meeting. All it does is give us the same fair chance to talk to those employees as the employer has every single day. It doesn't give us any special rights. It doesn't give us any other thing except the ability to talk to them. They can say yes or they can say no. If they say no, then it's over with. If they say yes, then they ought to have a right to have a union on the job and have a voice on the job so that they can get better wages and better benefits and better health care so that they can make that place safer and healthier to work in, and so that they can ultimately forge a partnership with their employer as equals so that everybody benefits from the enterprise and not just the people at the top.
Richard Trumka, we're going to have you back on again soon for that part of the conversation. But AFL-CIO President Richard Trumka, always good to talk to you. Thanks so much for joining us today. Well, the transition to a green economy has fueled a boom in ESG investing. Investors required to invest in ESG products has nearly doubled over the last year, and it's expected to nearly double again over the next 2 years, at least according to EY. Let's bring in Yahoo Finance's Jared Blickery, who's got his eye on some of those moves there. And Jared, we talk so much about ESG, but really the reality is there's no real standard to even define what that looks like.
You hit the nail on the head there, because let's dial back 3 or 4 years when ESG was not a household word. All you had to do to comply was basically not be into fossil fuels, have some kind of onerous corporate governance structure. And so these funds tended to be just filled with some of the highest growth name stocks. For instance, a lot of the FANG stocks, technology stocks. You imagine Facebook probably has a very good green footprint. And over the years, though, as ESG has risen, funds have become more specific and really tried to target certain ideals that their customers would want. So the takeaway from the EY report is fund managers can't come up with products that would be funds and hedge funds fast enough to fill the demand. It's also worth noting, and this is just a little bit of a breaking news that kind of ties in here, New York City and Mayor Bill de Blasio only today on Earth Day are suing Exxon, Shell, BP, and the American Petroleum Institute. And this is based on claims of deceptive trade practices and greenwashing. And the energy sector, traditional energy sector, and maybe we can take a look at the Wi-Fi Interactive, it's done very well this year to date. as clean energy has kind of lagged. However, I would also note that the clean energy sector did very well over the trailing year. So here's year to date in energy, and here's clean energy. We have a lot of wind and solar names. You can see a lot of red on your screen there. That's year to date, but check out this is going to be 1 year. Here we go. And if you look at some of these names, I mean, we're looking at Enphase Energy up, what, 333%, something like that. Very impressive.
Yeah, it's been incredible to see some of those moves. I mean, some would argue that the valuations are stretched significantly, largely because there's been so much optimism around the president's climate initiatives. Jared Blickery, thanks so much for that. Coming up, the UN calling for rich countries to do more to help emerging economies make the green transition. We'll be speaking to UN Climate Change Executive Secretary Patricia Espinosa. Before we go to break, though, take a look at how much electricity is generated in the U.S. This is a chart looking at the source of that energy. EIA reporting fossil fuels accounted for more than 60% in 2020. Renewable energy and nuclear at just 20%. Certainly likely to see that mix evolve over the next several years. We'll be right back. It has been roughly 5 years since the Paris Agreement was signed, and member countries will gather this November in Glasgow to discuss how to implement the changes after putting forth their emissions targets tied to the agreement. UN Climate Change Executive Secretary Patricia Espinosa says the pressure is now on developed countries. She says they simply haven't done enough to lift emerging countries and help them with that transition to the green economy. I spoke with her ahead of the White House summit and asked her where she thinks things stand 5 years after Paris. Take a listen.
I would say that what we have seen in the last years has been, a lack of leadership in really driving the process forward and trying to implement the Paris Agreement as soon as possible. I think that Paris was a very, very important moment in the process of addressing the climate emergency. But then after that, we didn't see really very strong levels of ambition coming forward from parties. This year, and with the re-entering of the US to the Paris Agreement, what we are hoping to see is finally that leadership and the possibility of showing the world that governments, that the leaders of the world are willing and determined to drive that very deep process of transformation forward towards a more sustainable, more healthy, and greener future.
There's a real divide between what we have seen in developed countries and developing countries. Many emerging countries really have come out of this pandemic shouldering enormous amounts of debt. To what extent, as they look to invest in green energy, to what extent do you see the impacts from extreme climate exacerbating the inequities that already exist globally?
Well, we always say that climate change is really a multiplier of every single challenge that humanity is facing. And yes, unfortunately, this means that the countries that are most vulnerable, that are, the poorer countries, unfortunately, really endure a lot of the costs and of the negative consequences of climate change. I am encouraged to see that within the international financial institutions, the discussion is taking place on how to support those countries. We need to remember that regarding climate change, as long as this transformation does not happen everywhere in the world, we all will be affected. Because of course, climate change does not recognize any borders. It doesn't recognize any kind of political signals. So we really need to be very conscious that if we are to overcome climate change, it means we need to do it all together.
You talked about the help that is needed from the developed countries, and yet you had those countries pledge back in 2009 to commit at least $100 billion a year in climate financing. They have not met those commitments. What specifically can the UN do to get more of the advanced nations on board, especially if it is a collective global effort?
I would say that in the case of the 100 billion, the mobilization of 100 billion by 2020, that was agreed over 10 years ago, it has really become one of the most important elements to ensure a good outcome at COP26. It's not because that amount will really be enough or sufficient to drive the transformation. It has become something like, a trust-building signal where developed countries would be sending the signal that they are actually willing to comply with the commitments that they make. And I also want to underline that regarding support, yes, back then the commitment to mobilize 100 billion was made, but also to support developing countries in terms of capacity building in technology as well. And those are two other areas that need to be addressed. This is the only way that we can create this momentum and this dynamic globally that will, for sure, take us towards the goals of the Paris Agreement.
We talk a lot about how climate change affects the way we live, but it also, for many, affects where they live. We've seen the UN put out this number of more than 20 million people being forced to leave their homes because of extreme climate in the current conditions. Which communities are you seeing that are most vulnerable?
Well, look, for example, in the case of the Pacific Islands, right? The Pacific Islands, they no, they are counting with the fact that they will be losing a lot of their land. And in some cases, they are even counting that they will be losing their territories altogether. And there I remember talking with a Prime Minister of Fiji, for example, where in Fiji they are already talking about legislation in order to give some status to the people from neighboring countries, neighboring island countries that would need to, would probably come and seek a place to live in Fiji. That's one thing I can tell you. In Central America, which is, well, a reality I know because I come from Mexico, right? Central America has been hit by very severe drought over the last years. And what has happened is that the migration flows from Central America towards the US through Mexico have just increased enormously. And what does that mean? It means, you know, women, children traveling alone, being very vulnerable to people trafficking with people, with them, with migrants, organizations, organized crime, and they are being abused. They are being also they take their money away. It's really very dramatic. In the case of Africa, for example, the UN has also identified a linkage with between the Sahel region, the situation that has developed in the Sahel region, with migration towards Europe. And that's also, as we know, very, very dramatic. So we are seeing in this regard that climate change becomes then not only a development issue, purely economical, but also a security issue, an issue that relates to stability in many regions.
Well, that wraps up our Earth Day special, Planet Earth in crisis. But we're going to keep that climate conversation going tomorrow to round out our week-long series. Of course, Zach, we've got day 2 of that Leader Summit over at the White House, but we're also going to be taking a look at the innovation side of things on our show. We'll be speaking to Climeworks co-founder Christoph Gebold, who is behind that carbon capture technology you've heard so much about. We've also got Archer Aviation co-founders Brad Adcock and Adam Goldstein, both of those guests joining us tomorrow. We've got much more, though, of the day's news and market action on the other side of the break. Keep it right here on Yahoo Finance Live.